You know, when we talk about sex and performance, we almost always focus on the physical side of things, right? But what if I told you the most important sex organ is actually the one between our ears? We're about to dive into just how true that is, because what's happening in our minds is often just as critical, if not more so, than what's happening in our bodies.
And look, this isn't just some abstract idea. The numbers paint a very real picture. For instance, research shows a staggering 43% of women report dealing with some form of sexual dysfunction. Seriously, think about that. That is nearly 1 in 2.
And hey, this isn't just a women's issue. For men, that number is also huge, sitting at around 31%. When you see figures this high for both men and women, it becomes crystal clear that we're not talking about a fringe issue. This is a widespread, very human experience.
Numbers like that tell us one thing for sure. This can't all be about purely physical or medical problems. It just can't. It forces us to ask a much deeper question. If it's not always a physical issue, what are the powerful psychological drivers at play here?
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to go on a little journey from the inside out. We'll start with that deep connection between mind and body, then zoom right into that inner monologue in your brain. From there, we'll look at how our relationships get wired, explore the big cultural scripts we're all handed, and finally, see how just understanding all this is the first step to rewriting the whole thing.
So, first up, let's tackle the big picture. You know, for the longest time, if there was an issue with sexual function, the first place anyone looked was for a purely medical cause. But we now know that's like trying to understand an entire movie by only watching one scene. The reality is so much richer, so much more complex.
To really get it, you have to look at the whole person. The idea today is that our biology, things like hormones and blood flow, is totally tangled up with our psychology, our thoughts and emotions, and our social context, like our relationships. This all-in-one view is called the biopsychosocial model, and it's key because it shows how all of these layers are constantly talking to each other.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that psychology piece. A huge breakthrough, a real game changer in understanding sexual performance came when researchers shifted their focus away from the body and toward the brain. Specifically, toward that inner monologue that's always running in our heads, especially during sex.
A massively influential idea in this area comes from a psychologist named David Barlow. See, before him, most people assumed that anxiety itself was what killed arousal, but he proposed something a bit more nuanced. It's not just the feeling of anxiety, but what that anxiety does to our attention. It creates a kind of mental static, what he called cognitive interference, that pulls our focus away from the actual experience of pleasure.
And that mental static leads to this key concept called spectatoring. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like this. Imagine you're at an incredible movie, but instead of getting lost in the story, you're just sitting there critiquing the camera angles. That's spectatoring. You become a detached judge of your own performance, asking, am I doing this right, instead of simply being present and feeling the sensations.
And this is where things get really tricky, because it kicks off a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. It all starts with a sense of pressure to perform. That pressure triggers negative thoughts. What if I fail? Which leads directly to that spectatoring we just talked about. Well, once your brain is busy judging instead of feeling, the physical signals for arousal get disrupted. And of course, when arousal falters, your brain logs it as a failure, which only amps up the anxiety for the next time around.
It is a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. The very act of worrying about failure distracts you from the pleasure and connection that actually fuel arousal in the first place. Your brain gets so tied up in the what-ifs that it completely misses out on the what is.
This process really shows us something crucial. Dysfunctional beliefs, ideas like sex has to end in orgasm every single time. They don't always shut down our arousal directly. Instead, as this bottom path here shows, they trigger that cognitive distraction we've been talking about, and it's that distraction that ultimately gets in the way of our body's natural response.
Okay, so we've looked deep inside the individual mind. Now, let's zoom out to the dynamic between people. Because let's be real, sex rarely happens in a vacuum. It happens within relationships, and those relationships are profoundly shaped by our earliest life experiences.
This is where attachment theory comes in. The basic idea is that our first bonds, usually with our parents, create a kind of internal programming, or blueprint. This blueprint pretty much dictates our expectations for closeness, our ability to trust, and our comfort with vulnerability in all our future relationships, especially the romantic ones.
And this blueprint often results in one of a few main styles. If you're securely attached, you're generally comfortable with intimacy, and sex is often a way to express affection.
For someone with an anxious style, there's a deep craving for closeness, but also a fear of abandonment, so sex can become a way to seek reassurance. Then you have the avoidant style, where intimacy itself feels threatening. For these individuals, casual, emotion-free sex can feel a lot safer because it sidesteps the perceived risks of getting too close.
So we've gone from the mind to the relationship. Let's zoom out one final time to the broadest layer of influence, our culture. Because from the moment we're born, society, religion, and our families are handing us powerful scripts about what sex is, what it means, and how we're supposed to feel about it.
One of the most potent of these scripts, especially within some religious communities over the last few decades, is known as purity culture. At its core, it's a belief system that directly links a person's moral worth to their sexual behavior, specifically their abstinence before marriage.
And the core messages of this culture can be incredibly damaging. It often frames a person's worth as being tied to their virginity, portrays sex itself as something dangerous or dirty, and can even cast natural sexual desire as a moral failing. The cumulative effect is a deep-seated sexual shame that can be incredibly difficult to unlearn.
And you can't just flip a switch on this kind of programming. The shame and guilt don't magically disappear after a wedding. As one source puts it, these feelings do not go away even when sex becomes permitted. The underlying psychological framework is still there.
This internalized shame has profound physical consequences. I mean, think about it. If the brain has been taught for years that sex is a threat, the body listens. This can manifest as low desire or difficulty with arousal. It can even lead to conditions like vaginismus, where the body's muscles involuntarily tighten so much that intercourse becomes painful or even impossible. The psychological fear literally becomes a physical reality.
So we've explored the anxious inner monologue, the blueprint of our relationships, and the cultural scripts we inherit. What does this all mean when we put the pieces together? What we've seen is that sexual performance isn't a simple one-dimensional issue. It's the result of three interacting layers: the anxious thoughts in our mind, the attachment patterns that shape our relationships, and the cultural scripts about shame that we've internalized. They all feed into each other.
So the most empowering takeaway from all of this is that awareness is the beginning of change. Simply recognizing these psychological drivers and understanding that you're not broken and it's not just you is a powerful first step. It opens the door to better communication with a partner, deeper connection with yourself, and ultimately, a healthier and more fulfilling relationship with sex.
And this leaves us with a final and, I think, hopeful thought. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. They learn. So if our minds can learn to build these complex barriers to intimacy, doesn't it make sense that, with awareness and effort, they can also learn how to take them down?